Ruth Calloway had spent 74 years learning how to knead very little. Growing up poor in rural Virginia, the youngest of 6 children, she'd been taught early that wanting too much was how you got hurt. So she'd kept her wants small and manageable. A good husband. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. A quiet home. Enough food on the table. Some beauty in the garden. For 51 years, Herbert Calloway had given her all of those things and more. He'd been a steady man, a carpenter who built furniture that lasted, who never raised his voice, who laughed at his own jokes even when nobody else did, who brought her wildflowers from the roadside in May because, he said, store flowers had no story in them. She hadn't known how much space he occupied in a room until the room was empty. Herbert died on a Tuesday morning in early October, falling asleep in the armchair by the window where he always read after breakfast and simply not waking up. The doctor called it peaceful. Ruth called it a Tuesday that ended everything. The months that followed were the strange, colorless kind that grief produces, where every day looks identical and yet nothing feels familiar. Ruth's daughter, Carol, drove up from Raleigh on weekends when she could. Her son, Paul, called on Sundays from Seattle, his voice carrying the particular careful gentleness of someone who doesn't know what to say but wants credit for trying. Neighbors brought casseroles. The church ladies came by with their quiet prayers and their warm hands. Ruth thanked them all and meant it, but found that company, however kind, did not fill the specific shape of the absence Herbert had left. She was fine. She told everyone this. She was fine in the way that people are fine when they have decided fineness is the only available option. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in January, 3 months after the funeral, in an envelope so old the paper had gone soft at the corners. The return address was the law firm of Hargrove and Oakes in Calder's Mill, North Carolina. Ruth had never heard of Calder's Mill. The letter was brief. It informed her that she was the sole heir to the estate of one Miriam Grace Aldridge, who had passed away at the age of 93 in November. Miriam Aldridge had left Ruth a property, the old Whitmore Schoolhouse at 14 Bell Creek Road, Calder's Mill, along with its entire contents, which had remained untouched and sealed since 1965. Ruth read the letter 3 times, standing at her kitchen counter with her reading glasses still on, and then she put the kettle on because that was what you did when something confusing happened. She had no idea who Miriam Grace Aldridge was. She called the attorney, a man named Philip Oakes, who had a courteous, precise way of speaking that suggested he'd delivered a great many pieces of complicated news over the years. He confirmed the basics. Miriam Aldridge had been the last surviving member of the family that had originally established and operated the Whitmore Schoolhouse from 1923 until its closure in 1965. Miriam had owned the property outright for 50 years, paying the taxes each year through a trust, maintaining the building as best she could from a distance, but never reopening it and never selling it. In her will, drawn up in 2019 and updated twice since, she had left everything to Ruth Eleanor Calloway of Martinsville, Virginia. Why? Ruth asked. There was a pause on the line. Mr. Oakes cleared his throat. The will contains a handwritten letter addressed to you personally, Mrs. Calloway. Miss Aldridge specified that you should receive it when you arrived at the property. She felt, and I quote, that the explanation belongs to the place itself. Ruth looked out her kitchen window at the February garden, gray and bare, at the birdbath Herbert had built the spring before he got sick. She was 74 years old. She had a bad left knee, a house she owned free and clear, an IRE that would last her another decade with care, and a grief that had settled into her bones like cold weather settles into old joints. Steady and aching and simply present. She thought about what she had to lose by going. She thought about what she had to gain by staying. She drove to Calder's Mill the following Friday. The town was small in the way that small southern towns are small, with a specific history visible in its bones. A post office that had been there since the 30s. A diner with hand-lettered specials on a chalkboard outside. A hardware store with a porch. 2 churches on opposite corners of the main intersection, each apparently determined to outlast the other. The kind of place where everyone knows the new car in the parking lot by lunchtime. Philip Oakes's office was above the hardware store, accessible by a narrow staircase with a worn wooden rail. He was a small, Neat man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and a handshake that was firm but not theatrical. He gave her the key, a large old skeleton key on a length of cotton twine, along with a folder of property documents, and the letter that Miriam Aldridge had left for her. The letter was sealed with a small wax disc pressed with a flower pattern. Violets, Ruth thought. Keep it sealed until you're inside, Mr. Oakes said. Those were her wishes. She was very specific. Ruth nodded. Was she a difficult woman? He considered this with the care of someone who chooses words for a living. She was a woman who knew her own mind, he said. She was 89 when she came in to draft the will, and she sat in that chair where you're sitting now, and she told me exactly what she wanted without a single moment of uncertainty. She said she'd been waiting 40 years to do it. Ruth drove out to Bell Creek Road following the handwritten directions the attorney had given her. The GPS on her phone lost the signal just past the edge of town, which did not surprise her. The road ran through farmland first, flat fields with old fence lines, then climbed into a stretch of hardwood forest where the trees were enormous and close, and the light came down in long slanted bars. In February, with the leaves gone, the forest had a skeletal beauty, all gray lines and pale sky. She almost missed the turn. A mailbox that had lost its number stood at the edge of a gravel lane, and she only noticed the lane because of the gap in the tree line. She turned in and drove slowly, her small Civic bumping over frozen ruts, and then the lane curved and the building appeared. The Whitmore Schoolhouse was a single-story structure of white-painted clapboard, approximately 40 feet long, with a covered entry porch running the full width of the front. The paint had gone thin in places, showing weathered wood beneath, and moss had colonized the north side of the roof. Two large windows flanked the front door, their glass intact, but clouded with years of dust and condensation. A bell tower rose from the roofline above the entrance, small and square, the bell still there, dark with tarnish, motionless. Around the building, the land had been let go entirely. Old field grass and winter-brown weeds had grown chest-high and been flattened by years of snow. Young trees had established themselves along the southern edge. A stone wall to the east was mostly standing, the kind of wall built by hand with whatever rocks came out of the ground, mortarless and patient. Ruth sat in her car for a long moment, looking at it. Then she got out, pulled her coat tighter against the February cold, and walked up the path to the door. The key turned in the lock without resistance, which surprised her. She'd expected rust and struggle, the theatrical difficulty of things long undisturbed. Instead, the lock turned smoothly, as if it had been oiled recently, and the door swung inward on hinges that gave only the quietest complaint. The smell reached her first. Old wood and chalk dust, and something else beneath those, something she couldn't name immediately, something like paper and dried flowers and time itself. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The schoolhouse was one large room, as these old rural schools always were. The desks were still there, rows of them, the old kind with wrought iron frames and wooden tops worn smooth by decades of small elbows, inkwell holes still in their corners though the inkwells themselves were gone. The teacher's desk stood at the front, larger and more imposing, facing its small congregation of empty seats. A chalkboard ran the full width of the front wall, and on it, in chalk that had somehow survived 60 years of sealed air, were words. Ruth walked forward slowly, her shoes making no sound on the dusty wooden floor, and read what the chalkboard said. It said, "For the children who came here and for the ones who couldn't. For what was taken and what remains. For Ruth, who will understand." Ruth stood very still, reading the words again. She reached into her coat pocket and took out Miriam Aldridge's letter, still sealed. She found the nearest desk and sat down in it, which required some negotiation with her bad knee and the desk's dimensions, which had not been designed for a 74-year-old woman. She broke the wax seal carefully, preserving the violet impression, and unfolded 3 pages of small, precise handwriting. "Dear Ruth," the letter began. "You don't know me, but I know you. I knew you before you knew yourself, which I understand is a strange thing to say to a grown woman. Let me try to explain. My name is Miriam Grace Aldridge. I was born in 1930, the daughter of Thomas Aldridge and his wife Clara, who was born Clara Whitmore before her marriage. The Whitmore Schoolhouse was built by my grandfather, James Whitmore, in 1923, and it was named for the family who built it and for the family whose land it stood on and for the community it was meant to serve. But the name it carried longest, the name the children who attended it used among themselves, was simpler. They called it the good school. I need to tell you why they called it that. And then I need to tell you why it closed. And then I need to tell you why I have left it to you. A woman I have never met. A woman who was born the same year the school shut its doors. In 1923, when James Whitmore opened the school, the county provided separate and deliberately unequal facilities for black children and white children. The county school for black children in this region was a single room in a church basement that flooded regularly, with no heating, no books provided, and a teacher paid a third of what the white school teachers earned. The county considered this sufficient. James Whitmore did not consider it sufficient. He was a complicated man, not a saint, not without his own blindnesses and failures, but on this particular matter he was clear-eyed in a way that cost him. He opened his school to any child who could walk to it. He hired 2 teachers, one white and one black, paid them the same wage, and informed the county that he would continue to do so regardless of what anyone thought about it. The county thought a great deal about it, for a very long time, at considerable volume. James Whitmore withstood every year of it. Ruth stopped reading and looked up at the rows of empty desks. The February light came in thin through the clouded windows, laying pale rectangles across the dusty floor. She thought about a man standing exactly where she was standing, holding his ground in 1923 in rural North Carolina, and what that must have cost him in ways. The letter wasn't even counting. She kept reading. The school operated from 1923 until 1965, 42 years. In that time, it educated hundreds of children from both communities, some of whom went on to college, to professions, to lives that the county's separate and unequal system would never have prepared them for. The school had a library of 800 books. It had a garden where children grew food that supplemented the school lunches. It had a music program. It had a teacher named Eloise Calder who taught there for 27 years and who, by every account I have been able to find, was one of the finest educators this county ever produced. It closed in 1965 for reasons I am still ashamed of, even though the decisions that caused the closure were made before I was old enough to stop them. The desegregation battles of the early 1960s brought federal attention to the region, and the county, trying to demonstrate compliance while maintaining control, put pressure on private institutions they could not legally regulate, but could make financially untenable. Grants disappeared. Inspectors arrived with increasingly creative objections. Tax assessments climbed. Insurance requirements multiplied. My father, who had inherited the school from his parents, fought for 3 years. When he finally ran out of resources, he closed it rather than compromise its standards. He sealed the building in June of 1965, paid the taxes through a trust he established for the purpose, and told me he hoped one day someone would find a use for it worthy of what it had been. He died in 1972 without seeing that happen. I am 93 years old, and I have not seen it happen either. But I believe it will happen now, because I believe in the person I am leaving it to. Ruth looked up again from the letter. The building was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the trees, a bird called twice and went silent. She had no idea how Miriam Aldridge knew who she was. She turned to the next page. You are wondering how I know you. I will tell you. In 1965, when the school closed, the last class enrolled at Whitmore included a girl named Delia Harmon. Delia was 9 years old, the daughter of Samuel Harmon, who sharecropped on land adjacent to this property. She had been attending Whitmore for 2 years. She was, by her teacher's account, an extraordinary student, the kind of child who reads everything she can find and then asks where to find more. When the school closed, Delia had nowhere to go. The county school for black children in this district was 20 miles away with no transportation provided. Samuel Harmon could not afford to lose a day's work to drive her, even if he'd had a reliable vehicle to drive her in. Delia Harmon's formal education ended in June of 1965 at the age of 9. Ruth's breath had gone quiet. She was reading very carefully now. Delia Harmon grew up. She worked. She married a man named James Calloway, and later a man named Herbert Calloway, by whom she had 2 children. She carried her interrupted education with her the way people carry things that were taken before they were finished with them. She taught herself to read well and widely from the public library. She became, late in her life, an advocate for rural education funding in Virginia. doing volunteer work that did more good than it had any right to without institutional support. Delia Harmon Calloway died in 2003. She was Herbert Calloway's mother. She was your mother-in-law. Ruth sat absolutely still in the small desk in the cold schoolhouse with the letter shaking slightly in her hands. Herbert had mentioned his mother. Of course he had. She died before Ruth and Herbert married. So Ruth had never met her, had known her only through Herbert's stories, through the photograph on Herbert's dresser of a small, serious woman with steady eyes who had worked hard all her life and asked for little. Herbert had said his mother read everything, had said she'd had very little schooling, but you'd never know it from talking to her, had said she'd been fierce about education for her children in a way that sometimes puzzled him until he was old enough to understand what she'd been denied. Ruth had thought she understood that story. She understood now that she'd understood only the surface of it. She turned to the third page, her hands still trembling. I spent many years trying to find a way to make something right that cannot be made right. What was taken from Delia Harmon cannot be given back. 42 years of her potential life as an educated woman cannot be restored. The career she might have had, the scholarship she might have pursued, the things she might have taught her own children, all of that is simply gone. But this building remains. And what is inside it remains. And perhaps more importantly, what this place represents remains. The idea that a school is not just a building but a promise, and that a promise, even a broken one, still has a shape you can hold. I am leaving you this property because you loved Herbert Calloway, and Herbert Calloway's mother was the last student enrolled at this school before it closed. I am leaving it to you because you are the person most connected to Delia Harmon, who is still living and still vigorous. I know you are 74. I know what 74 looks like. My mother was vigorous at 74, and I intend to consider you the same until proven otherwise. I am leaving it to you with no instructions. What you do with it is entirely your decision. Sell it if you need to. Tear it down if it serves no purpose. But I hope you will go inside first and look at what is there and consider whether something might still be done with it. Not for me. Not even for the memory of Delia Harmon, though her memory deserves honoring. But for the children in this county who still need what this building was always meant to provide. The last line of the letter read, "The books are still on the shelves. They have been waiting 60 years for someone to read them." Miriam Grace Aldridge had signed it with a hand that was still precise despite its age. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Ruth folded the letter and sat for a long time in the cold room, not crying, not thinking in any organized way, just sitting with the weight of what she'd read. The desks stood in their patient rows. The chalkboard held its 60-year-old message. The books, she could now see, lined the back wall behind the last row of desks on shelves that ran floor to ceiling, hundreds of them, their spines faded but present. She got up slowly, her knee protesting, and walked to the back of the room. The books were organized by subject and level, the way a real library organizes books, not the way people usually think of a rural one-room school. Science, history, mathematics, literature, a whole shelf of geography with maps tucked into their covers. A row of primers at the bottom for the youngest children, their bindings worn soft with small hands. At the top of the tallest shelf, visible only when she stood on her toes, a row of books with cloth covers in deep green and burgundy that looked older than the others. She pulled one out carefully. It was a history of North Carolina, published in 1931, with handwritten notes in the margins in a small, neat script. Notes like a student's notes, questions and observations, and the occasional underline. She looked at the inside cover and found a bookplate that said property of Whitmore School, Calder's Mill, NC, EST 1923. She pulled out another. A mathematics text from 1940, the pages soft with use. Another bookplate. More marginal notes. A child's initials penciled inside the back cover, T.W., with the date 1943. Ruth moved along the shelves, not taking inventory, not making plans, just touching, just being present with it. At the end of the shelf, standing slightly apart from the others, was a slim notebook with a red paper cover, the kind children used for compositions. She opened it and found handwriting, a child's handwriting, large and careful and still full of personality. At the top of the first page, in pencil, my journal, Delia May Harmon, age 8. Miss Carter's class. 1964. Ruth sat down on the floor between the last row of desks and the shelves, right there on the dusty boards, her bad knee be damned, and she read. Delia Harmon had been 8 years old, and she had written with the unself-conscious authority of a child who has discovered that writing is a way to keep things. She wrote about her walk to school, 1.5 miles each way down Bell Creek Road, and how she counted the red-winged blackbirds on the fence posts. She wrote about the lessons, about Miss Carter, who she clearly adored with a devotion that comes through even in an 8-year-old's simple sentences. She wrote about the library, about a book she'd found about the ocean, about how she'd never seen the ocean but planned to. She wrote about her father, about the farm, about her mother's cooking. She wrote about a boy named Marcus who sat 2 rows over and threw paper and got sent to stand in the corner, and she thought this was extremely funny. The journal ended abruptly in the middle of a page. The last entry was dated June 3, 1965. It said, "Miss Carter is crying. I don't understand why, but I think it means something bad. Tomorrow is the last day. Nobody will tell me what happens after." There was no entry after that. Ruth sat on the floor of the old schoolhouse with Delia Harmon's journal in her hands and the February light moving across the room as the afternoon wore on, and she thought about a 9-year-old girl walking home down Bell Creek Road on the last day, not knowing that the last day was the last day, that the good school was closing forever, that the particular education she was receiving, the kind that treated her as someone whose mind was worth developing, was ending before she'd learned to read well enough to sustain her own learning. She thought about Herbert, about how he'd spoken of his mother with a reverence that she'd always attributed to simple filial love and had never fully unpacked. She thought about the fierceness Herbert had inherited, his insistence on doing things right, his patience with work that mattered, his absolute refusal to cut corners on the furniture he built because, he'd always said, a thing worth making is worth making to last. She thought. Delia Harmon's education was cut off at 9 years old, and she spent the rest of her life making up for it. And she raised a son who built things to last, and that son married Ruth. And now Ruth was sitting on the floor of the school that failed Delia Harmon, holding the journal Delia had left behind. She didn't know yet what she was going to do about it, but she was beginning to understand why Miriam Aldridge had waited 40 years to find the right person to give it to. Ruth drove back to Philip Oakes's office before it closed, the key in her pocket and the folder of documents on the passenger seat, and Delia's journal wrapped carefully in her scarf on the back seat. The attorney looked up when she came in and read something in her expression that made him set down his pen. "What's the condition of the building?" she asked. "Structurally. Do you know?" He nodded. Miss Aldridge had it inspected in 2020. She hired a structural engineer from Raleigh. "The bones are sound," he said. "The foundation is solid stone. The frame is old-growth longleaf pine, which doesn't rot, the way newer lumber does. The roof needs replacing. The electrical doesn't exist, which is to say there is none. It was never wired. The plumbing is an outhouse around back. But the structure itself will stand for another 100 years with basic maintenance." Ruth nodded slowly. "And the property taxes?" "Covered through the trust for another 12 years. After that they'd fall to you." "What are they?" He told her. She did the math. It was manageable. "Has anyone expressed interest in purchasing it?" "Not to me." Miss Aldridge turned down 2 inquiries over the years. One developer and one individual. She said the property wasn't for sale at any price until the right person had seen it. Ruth was quiet for a moment, looking at the key in her hand. Then she said, "I need to make some phone calls before I decide anything. But I want you to know I'm not selling it. I just need to figure out what I'm keeping it for." Philip Oakes smiled for the first time since she'd entered his office that morning. "That," he said, "is what Miss Aldridge expected you to say. She told me you'd say something like that. She said you were Herbert Calloway's wife, and Herbert Calloway's wife would know what to do with something worth saving." Ruth drove home to Martinsville in the dark, the headlights cutting a path through the February night, Delia Harmon's journal on the back seat. She had not been expecting, at 74, to have a project. She had not been expecting to drive 2 hours to a town she'd never heard of and walk into a sealed building and find her late husband's mother's childhood journal on a shelf. She had not been expecting to feel, for the first time since October, something other than the gray weight of grief. Not joy exactly, not yet, but the cousin of joy that you feel when something unfinished suddenly has a direction. She called Carol when she got home. Her daughter was quiet through the recounting and then said, "Mom, are you serious?" And then, "Can I come see it?" And then, after a longer pause, "I can come next weekend. I want to help." She called Paul the next day. He was less immediately enthusiastic, more cautious, which was his nature, the way Herbert had been cautious before committing to things. But he asked the right questions, the kind that showed he was actually thinking about it rather than just managing her. He said, "If you want to do something with it, you should do something with it." He said, "Grandma Delia would have had thoughts about this." He said, after a moment of quiet, "I think she'd say don't just make it a museum. Make it useful." Ruth sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and began writing down what she knew and what she didn't know and what she needed to find out. The list of what she didn't know was long. The list of what she needed to find out was longer. But the list of what she knew had something on it that she kept coming back to, that she underlined twice and then circled. What she knew was this: somewhere in Calder's mill and the surrounding county, there were children who needed the same thing Delia Harmon had needed in 1965. Not a museum, not a memorial, not a plaque on a wall. A good school. Carol arrived on Saturday morning driving a sensible SUV loaded with cleaning supplies, a folding table, 2 thermoses of coffee, and the particular energy of a woman in her late 40s who has decided to be useful. She was Herbert's daughter in the jaw and the forehead, the same steady brown eyes, the same way of walking into a room and immediately assessing what needed doing. Ruth had always loved this about her. It had also, on occasion, driven her slightly mad. They drove to Calder's mill together, Carol asking questions the whole way, practical ones mostly, about the roof and the electrical and the property taxes, but also the other kind, softer and more careful. "You're sure about this, Mom?" "Not because I think you shouldn't. Because I want to make sure you're doing it for the right reasons and not because you're looking for something to fill the house with now that Dad's gone." Ruth thought about this honestly, the way Herbert had taught her to think about things you didn't want to look at directly. He'd always said, "Just turn and face it, because it doesn't get smaller by you not looking." Probably both, she told Carol. The grief and the rightness of it. "I don't think those have to be separate." Carol nodded slowly. "That's a fair answer." The schoolhouse looked different in the gray February morning light than it had 2 days earlier, less like a discovery and more like a responsibility. Ruth noticed things she'd missed on the first visit. The way the porch railing had rotted through in 2 places, the missing shingles on the east slope of the roof, a crack in the foundation's exterior pointing on the north corner that would need examination. She stood outside with her coffee and made mental notes while Carol walked the perimeter with her phone, photographing everything. Inside, Carol moved slowly through the room, the way people move through places where history is thick enough to feel. She stopped at the rows of desks and ran her hand along the worn tops the way Ruth had. She stood at the chalkboard for a long time, reading the words. Ruth showed her Delia's journal, which she'd brought back wrapped in the same scarf. Carol read it at the teacher's desk, hunched forward the way she'd hunched over her own schoolwork as a girl. When she reached the last entry, she sat back and pressed her hand flat against the page, not reading, just resting it there. "Dad knew about this place?" she asked finally. "He knew his mother's schooling ended young. I don't think he knew about this specific school." Ruth paused. "He never mentioned it. But you know how he was with things that hurt. He held them quietly." Carol nodded. She closed the journal with care. Then she looked around the room with different eyes, the assessment eyes replaced by something more personal. "What are you thinking, Mom?" For real. Ruth had been organizing her thoughts for 2 days. She'd been doing it the way she organized a complicated sewing project, laying out all the pieces before committing to a seam. "This county still has the same problem it had in 1965, she said. "Different shape, same problem. Rural school districts with funding gaps. Children without access to enrichment programs. After-school resources that exist in wealthy districts and nowhere else." She'd looked it up. She'd read the county school board reports online and called the public library in Calder's Mill and spoken to a librarian named Gretchen who'd confirmed, with the particular weariness of someone who's been watching the same problem for decades, that yes, the county's educational resources were severely limited and yes, there were children who needed things the system wasn't providing. "I want to reopen it," Ruth said. "Not as a formal school, not in competition with the public system, as a supplemental learning center. After-school programs, tutoring, a reading program, maybe some weekend workshops. Something that fills the gaps. Something that does what it was built to do." Carol was quiet. Ruth let her be quiet. That's a big project, Carol said at last. I know. You're 74. I'm aware of that. You've never run a nonprofit organization or a community program or anything like that. I ran a household for 51 years and raised 2 children and managed Herbert's accounts when his hands got too bad for fine work and organized the church's food pantry for 12 years. I know how to make things function. Carol looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she said, Okay, what do you need? They spent the rest of the morning inventorying the building. Carol had brought a notebook and was meticulous about it in the way her father had been meticulous about measurements. Nothing approximated, everything precise. Roof replacement, she wrote. Electrical installation. Plumbing, minimal but functional, at minimum a bathroom inside. Floor repair in the northwest corner where water had gotten under at some point and warped 2 boards. Window reglazing. Porch reconstruction. The books she treated like something precious without being told to. She photographed each shelf before touching anything, then cataloged every title in a spreadsheet on her phone. 843 books total. A significant number still entirely usable. Some too fragile to handle safely. A small number water-damaged beyond recovery. These are worth preserving on their own, Carol said, photographing a shelf of the oldest volumes. As a historical collection, I mean. Not just as books to read. Some of these might be of interest to a university library or a historical society. That's good thinking. Ruth wrote it down. They ate lunch at the diner on Main Street, where the special was beef stew and the coffee was strong, and the woman behind the counter, whose name tag said Bev, looked at them with the open curiosity of a small town absorbing new information. You're the ones out at the old Whitmore place, Bev said. It wasn't a question. Word travels, Ruth said. Bev smiled. My grandmother went to school there. Both her grandmothers, actually. She refilled their coffee without being asked. What are you planning to do with it? Ruth told her, briefly. Bev set the coffee pot down and looked at her with an expression that was something between surprise and a thing that had been waiting a long time. My granddaughter is in 4th grade, she said. She's a reader. Her school doesn't have a library anymore. Budget cuts took it 3 years ago. She reads everything I give her, and then she stands in the kitchen asking me what she should read next, and half the time I don't know. Ruth looked at her. That's exactly the kind of child this place was built for. Bev was quiet for a moment, looking at the counter. Then she said, There's a woman you should talk to. Eleanor Briggs. She's retired, used to be a reading specialist with the county schools for 30 years. She lives on Orchard Road, about 2 miles out. She's been trying to get somebody to do something about the literacy gap in this county since before she retired, and she'll tell you the same story 3 different ways until you understand why it matters. Ruth wrote down the name. She also wrote down the names of the 2 men who came into the diner while they were eating. The first was a farmer named Garrett who said his son had a learning disability and the nearest specialist was 45 minutes away in good weather and considerably longer in bad. The second was a high school teacher named Marcus Webb, who went very still when Ruth explained about the school and then said, quietly, that his grandmother had attended Whitmore and had spoken of it her whole life. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. His grandmother's name had been Constance Webb. Ruth did not know that name from Miriam's letter, but she wrote it down anyway. She was beginning to understand that this place had roots deeper than any one story could hold. Eleanor Briggs turned out to live in a white farmhouse with a large vegetable garden visible through the kitchen window, bare in February but clearly elaborate in season, and a porch covered in hanging wind chimes that made soft music in the cold air. She was a compact woman in her late 60s with close-cropped silver hair and the direct manner of someone who has spent decades explaining things to people who didn't want to hear them and has made her peace with the work. She listened to Ruth without interrupting, which was unusual enough that Ruth noticed it. When Ruth finished, Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then said, How serious are you? Completely, Ruth said, because I've had people come through here with good intentions before. A foundation from Charlotte about 6 years ago. A church group the year before that. They meant well. They came in with energy, and then they encountered the actual difficulty of sustained community work, and they found reasons to redirect elsewhere. I'm not redirecting anywhere, Ruth said. This is the only place I have to be. Eleanor looked at her steadily. You're 74. So everyone keeps reminding me, Ruth said. My husband was 76 when he died, and he was still building furniture to order. Age is a number. Energy is a choice. Eleanor almost smiled. What do you need from me? Your knowledge. Your connections in this county. Your honest assessment of what this place could realistically become and what it can't. I don't want to build something beautiful that doesn't work. I want to build something that works, even if it's modest. That, Eleanor said, is the most sensible thing anyone has said to me about this county's education needs in 20 years. She stood up. Come on. I'll show you something. She drove Ruth in her truck to 3 different locations around the county. First, a church fellowship hall where a volunteer tutor ran a reading group for 6 children on Wednesday afternoons, the only such program available in a 15-mile radius. The tutor, a retired teacher named Hank, was there doing prep work when they arrived, and he shook Ruth's hand with the grip of someone who has been doing important work in obscurity for a long time and is quietly desperate for company. Then to a community center that had been trying for 4 years to launch an after-school program and failing consistently for lack of a stable space. Then to the elementary school on the county road, where the principal, a young woman named Dr. Anaya Peterson, met them in her office and spoke with the rapid, compressed intensity of someone who has a great deal to say and very few people willing to hear it. The need is documented, Dr. Peterson said, pulling a folder from her desk with the ease of someone who keeps it close for exactly this occasion. Third-grade reading levels in this district are 17 points below the state average. We have children who are smart, genuinely capable, who are falling behind not because of anything wrong with them, but because they go home to households where both parents work evening shifts and there's nobody to read with them and nobody to help with the work. She looked at Ruth. If you open that school as a reading and learning center, I will send you every child I can identify who needs it. I will send you parents. I will send you volunteers. I will show up myself on weekends if you need me. Ruth sat in that office and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not happiness, not yet, but the specific gravity of something that was supposed to happen beginning to happen. The obstacles appeared steadily over the following weeks, which was what obstacles do when you've decided to do something that matters. The first was money. Ruth had some savings. The house paid off, Herbert's pension, her own Social Security, and the modest proceeds from selling 2 pieces of furniture from Herbert's workshop that she'd kept for sentimental reasons, and then decided Herbert would rather they went somewhere they'd be used than somewhere they'd be mourned. It was enough to begin, but nowhere near enough to finish. The roof alone would cost more than she had liquid. She applied for 3 grants in the first month. She did this sitting at Herbert's work table with his old lamp on because the light was good and because it made her feel less alone. She'd never written a grant application in her life. She read everything she could find about how to do it, and then she wrote them in plain language, without the inflated vocabulary she found in the examples, because she'd always believed that if you couldn't explain something plainly, you didn't understand it well enough yet. Eleanor helped her with the second and third applications, sitting across the work table and asking sharp questions that forced Ruth to be specific where she'd been general and concrete where she'd been abstract. You keep writing about what this place was, Eleanor said one evening, red pen in hand over a draft. That's important, but funders want to know what it will be. They need numbers. How many children? How many hours? How many volunteers? What measurable outcome? I don't have those numbers yet. Then estimate them carefully and explain your methodology. She looked at Ruth over her reading glasses. Grantsmanship is a skill. You're learning it. Don't be embarrassed that it takes time. Ruth was not embarrassed. She was frustrated by the gap between knowing what she wanted to do and having the language to communicate it in a way that moved money. But she kept working. The second obstacle came from an unexpected direction. 3 weeks after her first visit to the schoolhouse, Ruth received a phone call from a man named Aldridge, who identified himself as Miriam's great-nephew and the family member most involved in settling the estate. He was polite, careful, and clearly uncomfortable about something. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I want to be respectful of Aunt Miriam's wishes. I genuinely do. But I have to be honest with you. There are members of the family who feel that the property should have stayed within the family, or at minimum been sold with proceeds divided among the heirs. Miriam had the legal right to leave it as she did, and no one is challenging that. But there's some feeling that the best thing for everyone would be if you were to sell the property and use the proceeds for whatever charitable purpose you have in mind, rather than trying to maintain a building that will require significant ongoing investment. Ruth sat with the phone in the kitchen, looking at the window over the sink where Herbert's row of small potted herbs sat on the sill. She'd kept watering them, even though she wasn't cooking much. She'd kept them because he'd planted them. Because some things you keep, even when the reason for them has changed shape. Mr. Aldridge, she said, your great-aunt left me the property specifically because she believed something should be done with it that couldn't be done by someone who saw it primarily as a financial asset. She spent 60 years paying taxes on a sealed building because she believed it was worth preserving. If I sell it and donate the money, whatever organization receives that money will use it for their priorities, not for this community. The Whitmore Schoolhouse exists here. The children who need it live here. The purpose it was built for still exists here. I understand that some of your family members are disappointed. I'm sorry for that, but I'm not going to sell it. There was a pause. Then Darren Aldridge said, quietly, Aunt Miriam told us you'd say something like that. She said, and I'm quoting her directly, she said Ruth Calloway will not be moved on this. She said it like it was a settled fact. Ruth felt a complicated warmth. This woman she had never met had believed in her so specifically and so thoroughly that she'd predicted, from the details of Ruth's character, as understood through Herbert's mother's story, how Ruth would respond to pressure. Miriam Aldridge had done her homework. I hope the family will come to understand the purpose behind her decision, Ruth said. I hope someday they'll be glad it went the way it did. She would later learn, through Philip Oakes, that Darren Aldridge had quietly donated $2,000 to the restoration fund she'd set up at the local bank. He'd listed himself as anonymous. She understood why, and she was grateful. The third obstacle was closer to home. Paul flew in from Seattle in March, ostensibly for a visit, but transparently to assess the situation in person, which was his right as her son and also somewhat irritating. He was Herbert's son in the directness, the way of saying the difficult thing without softening it so much it lost its edge. He drove out to the schoolhouse with her on his second day. He walked through it the way an engineer walks through a building, which he was not, but had adjacent instincts for from years of managing construction projects. He was quiet through most of it, touching walls, looking up at the ceiling, crouching to look at the floor damage in the corner. Finally, he stood in the middle of the room and said, Mom, I want to support you on this. I do. But I need you to tell me what the exit ramp looks like. What do you mean? If this doesn't work, if the funding doesn't come through, if the volunteers don't materialize, if the community doesn't engage the way you're hoping, what do you do? Ruth had thought about this. She'd thought about it specifically because Paul was going to ask it, and she wanted a real answer, not a deflection. I spend what I have on making the building safe and usable, she said. I open it as a reading room with the library that's already here. I find one volunteer, and I run one program. If that's all it ever becomes, a reading room for children in a county that doesn't have one, that's still something. It's still more than a sealed building with 800 books nobody can reach. Paul was quiet. And if your health changes? If your knee gets worse? If you can't make the drive? Then I find someone to run it, and I stay involved from a distance. Eleanor Briggs is already halfway to running it herself. Dr. Peterson at the elementary school has more energy than anyone I've met in years. This doesn't have to depend on me personally. It has to depend on the place and the purpose. I'm trying to build something that outlasts me, not something that needs me to function. Paul looked at her for a long moment with Herbert's brown eyes. Okay, he said. That's it. That's it. He looked around the room one more time. You're right that it's worth saving. And you're right that the right person to do it ended up being you. He paused. Dad would have been useful here. He'd have fixed that floor in an afternoon. Ruth looked at the warped boards in the corner. Yes, she said. He would have. They stood there together in the old schoolhouse, mother and son, in the specific quiet that exists around people who are thinking about someone they've lost, and outside the February wind moved through the bare trees, and the old bell in the tower turned slightly on its mount, not ringing, just acknowledging the air. Carol came back the following weekend with a contractor friend of hers named Deb, who did restoration work on historic buildings, and who walked through the schoolhouse with her trained eye and her measuring tape and came out at the end with a number. It was a large number. Not impossible, but large. It's entirely doable, Deb said. These old-growth pine frames don't give up. The bones are genuinely exceptional. Whoever built this in 1923 built it to last. She'd looked at the foundation, the framing, the roof structure. The costly part is the roof and the electrical. Everything else is cosmetic by comparison. Ruth asked if she would do the work. Deb said she would. She said she had a daughter who'd struggled with reading in elementary school and a particular feeling about places that existed to help children learn. She named a price that was fair and a timeline that was honest, and Ruth shook her hand. That night, Ruth sat at Herbert's work table and looked at her numbers. She looked at what she had, what she'd applied for, what she might realistically raise through community fundraising. She looked at the gap between those numbers and Deb's estimate. She opened her laptop and began writing a letter to every person she'd met in Calder's mill. Bev at the diner, Garrett the farmer, Marcus Webb the teacher, Dr. Peterson, Hank the volunteer tutor, the librarian Gretchen, Philip Oakes, Darren Aldridge, who she addressed with particular care. The letter explained what she was doing and why. It explained Delia Harmon's story, with the permission she felt Miriam's letter had implicitly granted her. It explained what the schoolhouse had been and what she believed it could become. It asked for help, specifically and without embarrassment, because she'd learned late in life that asking for help was not weakness, but was the most efficient way to let people do what they already wanted to do. She sent it on a Thursday evening and went to bed without knowing what would happen next. By Sunday, she had 23 responses. Not all of them were donations. Some were offers of time, of skills, of connections to other people who might help. Marcus Webb said he'd spread the word among his students' families. Gretchen said the library had a small community fund they could contribute. A woman Ruth didn't know named Patricia said her late husband had been one of the last students at Whitmore, and she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to do something with the building. Patricia's message was the one Ruth read 3 times. She'd been waiting, Patricia wrote, since she was a girl watching the doors close. She'd driven past it every year for 60 years. She'd stopped sometimes and sat in her car looking at it. She'd thought about it as a wound in the landscape, a place where something important used to be and wasn't anymore. And now it would be something again. And Patricia didn't have money, but she had time, and she had a truck, and she had a daughter who was an electrician, and if Ruth needed wiring done by someone who cared about why it mattered, Patricia's daughter would do it for materials only. Ruth wrote back immediately. She wrote, "Your late husband was in the right place to learn, and it's too late to give that back to him. But it's not too late to give it to the children in this county who need it now. I would be honored to have your daughter's help and yours." She sat back from the work table and looked at the window where Herbert's herbs were growing, the basil reaching toward the light with its particular optimistic tendency. She had a building. She had a plan. She had people who wanted to help. She had the story of a 9-year-old girl who'd lost access to her education 60 years ago, and a journal that proved the loss was real and particular and should not have happened. What she didn't have yet was the full funding, the final approvals, or the first child through the door. But she was 74 years old, and she had learned something important in those years about how things come together. They don't come together all at once. They come together one piece at a time, each piece making the next one slightly more possible, until one day you look at what you've assembled and realize it has become something that works. The schoolhouse was not yet open, but it was no longer sealed. And in the gap between sealed and open, something was growing. Ruth drove home from Calder's mill on a Sunday evening in late March, with the first real warmth of spring in the air and the road running through that stretch of hardwood forest where the trees had just begun to green at the edges. She rolled down the window. She could smell the earth. She thought about Herbert building his furniture in the workshop, the particular sound of his work, the patience it required. She thought about Delia Harmon walking a mile and a half down Bell Creek Road to a school that saw her clearly for 2 years and then went dark. She thought, "I'm not going to let it stay dark." The road curved out of the forest, and the town of Calder's mill came into view below, small and particular and full of people who had, without knowing it, been waiting for someone to ask them to help with something that mattered. Ruth Calloway put on her signal and drove down into it. Spring came to Bell Creek Road the way spring comes to places that have been waiting a long time. Slowly at first, then all at once. The old field grass around the schoolhouse greened from the roots. Wild violets appeared along the stone wall to the east, small and purple and persistent. The oak trees that had stood for what looked like a century put out their first pale leaves, and the light through them was the particular green gold that belongs only to April and only to old forests. Ruth noticed all of it. She had been spending 3 days a week in Calder's mill since March, and the drive through the hardwood forest had become one of the fixed points of her week, something she looked forward to in the way you look forward to things that are woven into a purpose. Deb had started work on the roof in the second week of March, her crew of 4 moving with the efficiency of people who knew old buildings and respected them. She'd found, once the damaged shingles were stripped, that the underlying structure was even sounder than her initial assessment had suggested. "The rafters are original," she told Ruth one afternoon, standing in the yard looking up. "Hand-cut, mortise and tenon joinery. Whoever built this knew what they were doing and didn't cut corners anywhere I can find." She said it with the satisfaction of a craftsperson recognizing another craftsperson's work across 100 years. Ruth thought of Herbert. She thought of him constantly in those weeks, not with the raw grief of the first months, but with something more like companionship. She'd bring him into conversations in her head. She'd think, what would Herbert say about this rafter joint? He'd say it was done right. He'd say someone cared. Patricia's daughter, whose name was Jo and who had her mother's directness and considerably more tattoos, ran the electrical work through April. She was 29 and had been an electrician for 8 years, and she approached the wiring of the old building with a seriousness that Ruth found immediately reassuring. Jo walked the building with her before starting and asked about intended use, about how many people at maximum, about whether there'd be a kitchen element, about lighting preferences. "I wanted to feel like what it was," Ruth told her. "Not a renovation, a restoration. The original windows, the original floor, the original proportions. But light enough to read by comfortably and warm enough that children can take their coats off." Jo nodded. She drew something quickly on a notepad. "I can do warm spectrum LED throughout. Fixtures that sit flush with the ceiling so they don't visually compete with the architecture. 2 independent circuits, so if one side's in use and the other isn't, you're not heating empty space." She looked up. "My mom told me about the woman whose journal you found. Delia Harmon." "Yes." Jo was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother went to Whitmore. Different era, but she went. She talked about it my whole life. About Miss Carter specifically. She said Miss Carter was the reason she ever believed she could think." Ruth stood in the room that Miss Carter had taught in for 27 years and felt the weight of that sentence settle into the air around her. "Some teachers leave that kind of mark," Ruth said. "Yeah." Jo looked at her notepad. "I'm going to do this job right." She did. The floor repair in the northwest corner was handled by a man named Robert Tisdale, a semi-retired carpenter who'd heard about the project through Marcus Webb and shown up on a Tuesday with his tools in a quiet manner and done 3 days of work for the cost of the materials. He matched the repair boards to the existing floor so well that Ruth could only find the patch if she already knew where to look. "You can't see the repair," she told him. "That's the idea," he said. "You repair something right, it disappears into the hole. That's the test." She wrote that down later. She wrote down a lot of things in those months, filling a series of spiral notebooks with the observations and decisions and small revelations that accumulated around the work. She'd never kept a journal before. She found that she needed one now, not for remembrance, but for thinking. Writing things down slowed her mind enough to see them clearly. The porch was rebuilt in May by a crew of volunteers that Carol organized through a combination of personal contacts and a post on a community Facebook group that spread further than anyone expected. 16 people showed up on a Saturday morning, ranging from a retired contractor who took quiet charge of the structural elements to a teenager named Destiny who had never held a hammer before and by noon was nailing boards with a confidence that made the contractor nod approvingly. Ruth made sandwiches and kept the coffee coming and stayed out of the way, which was its own kind of work. By the end of that Saturday, the porch was rebuilt and painted white, and the rotted railing had been replaced with new wood that matched the original profile as closely as Carol's research into historic photographs could determine. Ruth stood on it in the early evening after everyone had gone, looking out at the clearing, at the stone wall with its violets, at the tree line, at the old bell still in its tower. The building behind her had light in its windows for the first time in 60 years. She called Paul. "It has light," she said. "The building has light." A pause on the line. Then, "Good, Mom. That's really good." The books were the project that occupied Ruth most personally through the spring. She'd connected, through a librarian contact of Eleanor's, with an archivist at NC State who came to assess the collection and spent a full day in the schoolhouse with cotton gloves and a reference database on her laptop. Her name was Dr. Amara Osei, and she moved through the shelves with reverence that Ruth recognized and appreciated. 23 volumes are historically significant enough to warrant preservation treatment. Dr. Osei told her at the end of the day. The 1931 history with the marginalia is particularly valuable. The notes appear to span multiple decades of student use. She showed Ruth a page where 3 different hands, in 3 different pencils, had added observations to the same passage over what the ink aging suggested was a span of 30 years. 3 generations of children thinking about the same paragraph. Ruth looked at those 3 sets of handwriting and felt something she couldn't quite name. The continuity of it. The conversation across time. Can the collection stay here? Ruth asked. I want children to use these books, not just scholars. Dr. Osei considered this. The fragile ones should be digitized and the originals stored properly. But the majority of the collection is sturdy enough for supervised use. She looked around the shelves. This library is extraordinary for a rural school of this size and era. Whoever built this collection cared very much about what children should have access to. She paused. I'd like to come back. For research purposes. If that would be welcome. This building was built to be used, Ruth said. Come whenever you like. The grant results came in June. 1 rejection, 2 approvals. The approvals together totaled enough, combined with the community donations that had continued arriving in small amounts since her March letter, to cover everything Deb had estimated plus a modest operating reserve for the first year. Ruth sat at Herbert's work table with the approval letters in front of her and allowed herself 5 minutes of quiet satisfaction. Then she made a list of what came next. Eleanor came over that evening with a bottle of wine she said was not for celebrating prematurely, but for acknowledging progress, which was different. They sat at the kitchen table and talked for 3 hours about programming, about scheduling, about how to recruit volunteer tutors without burning them out, about what Dr. Peterson's referral process might look like, about the reading program structure Eleanor had been refining in her head for the past decade, waiting for somewhere to put it. Eleanor had opinions. She had them in quantity, and they were largely correct, which made her both valuable and occasionally exhausting. Ruth had come to appreciate both qualities. You should apply to be on the County Literacy Council, Eleanor told her. They have a small grant fund, and more importantly, they have relationships with the school districts. Being on the council would legitimize the Whitmore Center in ways that money alone can't. I don't know anything about county literacy councils. You know what this building is and what it can do. That's more than most of the people on the council know. Eleanor refilled her glass. Miriam Aldridge spent 50 years trying to influence county education policy from a distance. You're here. Use that. Ruth applied for the council seat. She spent July preparing the interior. The original desks, the ones Herbert would have loved for their joinery, were refinished by Robert Tisdale, who came back on his own initiative and spent a week with sandpaper and Danish oil until the wood glowed. The teacher's desk at the front was kept exactly as it was, not refinished, it's where preserved. Ruth thought of it as the desk that had held Miss Carter for 27 years and felt it would be wrong to remove the evidence of that. New bookshelves were built along the south wall to supplement the existing ones, made from the same pine species as the originals, by a woodworker in Calder's mill who'd heard about the project and asked if there was something he could contribute that used his hands. There was. Carol drove up for a long weekend in late July, and they hung things on the walls together. Reproductions of historical photographs of the school from its operating years, sourced through the County Historical Society with Marcus Webb's help. A framed copy of Delia Harmon's journal page, the last one, the one that ended mid-sentence. Ruth had deliberated about this. She'd asked Patricia, and Patricia had asked Delia's surviving relatives through connections Ruth didn't fully understand, but didn't need to. They'd said yes. They'd said they were glad something was being done. One of Delia's granddaughters, a woman named Tamara who lived in Durham, had sent a photograph of Delia taken in her 50s, a small, serious woman with steady eyes standing in a garden, and this hung near the door where every person entering would see it. Below the photograph, Ruth had printed a card that said, Delia May Harmon attended Whitmore School 1963 to 1965. Her last journal entry, written at age 9, asked what happened after. This center is the answer. Carol stood looking at it for a long time. Then she said, Dad would have built the shelves. He would have built everything, Ruth said, and complained that nobody measured properly. Carol laughed, the same laugh Herbert had had, from the same place in the chest. Ruth heard him in it, and was glad. The opening was scheduled for the second Saturday in September, which was when the school year would be several weeks established and families would have a sense of what their children needed. Dr. Peterson had already identified 23 children she wanted to refer to the after-school reading program. Eleanor had recruited 7 volunteer tutors, all retired educators, and trained them in the reading methodology she'd spent her career developing. Hank, the Wednesday afternoon tutor from the church hall, had agreed to move his program to Whitmore and had brought his 6 students with him, which meant the center would open with children already in it. The night before the opening, Ruth drove out to the schoolhouse alone. She let herself in with the key she'd been carrying since January, the same skeleton key on the cotton twine that Philip Oakes had slid across his desk. She didn't turn on the lights immediately. She stood in the dark room and let her eyes adjust, the way she'd done on the first day. The room was different now, cleaned and lit and filled with restored furniture and organized books and the photographs of the people who'd made this place what it had been. It was different, and it was also the same. The bones were the same. The proportions were the same. The purpose was the same. She walked to the back wall and found Delia's journal on the shelf where she'd returned it after the framed reproduction was made. She sat in the last row of desks, the way she'd sat the first day, her bad knee negotiated into position, and she opened it. She read it through one more time. The blackbirds on the fence posts. Miss Carter and her red pen. The boy Marcus throwing paper. The ocean that Delia had never seen but intended to. The entry that ended in the middle of a sentence. Ruth closed the journal and sat quietly in the darkroom for a while. She thought about what Miriam Aldridge had written, that the promise was broken but still had a shape you could hold. She thought about what Eleanor had said, about teaching matching even when it came late. She thought about what Patricia had said, about driving past a wound in the landscape for 60 years. She thought about Herbert, who had built things to last without knowing why his mother had cared so much about permanence, and who had passed that care on to Ruth in the 51 years of their life together, and who was gone now, but whose influence was standing in this room in the form of everything Ruth had become during those years. She thought, I would not be here without him, and he would not have been who he was without her, and she would not have been who she was without this school, even for 2 short years, and even though it ended too soon. The chains of care run long and invisible, and you only see them when something brings them into the light. Ruth turned on the lights. The room came up warm and clear, Joe's lighting doing exactly what it was designed to do, making the pine floors glow and the books readable and the space feel welcoming without feeling clinical. The old desks stood in their rows. The chalkboard held the message Miriam had written in 1965 that no one had erased. For the children who came here and for the ones who couldn't. Ruth walked to the chalkboard. She picked up a piece of chalk from the tray. Below Miriam's words, she wrote, and for the ones who are coming now. She stood back and looked at it. Then she went home and slept better than she had since October. The opening day was a Saturday in September with the kind of weather that September sometimes produces in North Carolina, a sky so blue it seemed personal, the air carrying just enough edge to be welcome after a long summer. Ruth arrived at 8 to find Eleanor already there with a folding table and a sign-in sheet, and a practical energy that suggested she had been waiting for this day for considerably longer than the months of restoration. People began arriving at 9. Families Ruth knew from her months in Calder's mill, families she didn't know yet. Several she was surprised to see. Bev from the diner brought her granddaughter, the reader who'd had no library for 3 years, a girl of about 9 with serious eyes and a book already under her arm. Garrett the farmer came with his son, who was 12 and solemn and shook Ruth's hand with the gravity of someone who'd been told this was important. Marcus Webb came with 2 colleagues from the high school. Dr. Peterson came with her husband and stood in the doorway looking at the restored room with an expression Ruth understood completely because she'd had it herself on the first day. Patricia came. She walked in slowly, her eyes moving over everything, taking it in the way you take in something that has been absent and returned. She stopped at Delia's photograph by the door. She stood there for a long time. Ruth went to stand beside her. She was younger than I realized, Patricia said quietly. In my memory she was grown, but she was a child when she left here. We were all children. Ruth didn't say anything. There was nothing to add. Patricia reached out and touched the frame of the photograph, just briefly, and then turned to Ruth with eyes that were full but steady. My husband would have been happy today. He is part of why it happened, Ruth said. Patricia nodded. Then she smiled, a real one, unhurried. Let me go meet some of these children. Tamara came, Delia's granddaughter from Durham, driving up that morning and arriving just after 10. She was a woman in her early 50s with her grandmother's steady eyes and an expressiveness Delia's photographs didn't show, a way of moving through a room that communicated interest in everything around her. She embraced Ruth at the door with a warmth that surprised them both, and then stood for a long time in front of the framed journal page. She turned to Ruth. "She told people about this school her whole life," Tamara said. "My grandfather, my mother, anyone who'd listen. She said it was the place where she first understood that her mind was worth something. She said that when it closed she felt like someone had told her they'd been wrong about that." Ruth held Tamara's gaze. "I can't give back what was taken from her." "I know." Tamara looked around the room, at the children already settling into the reading corner Eleanor had set up, at the tutors introducing themselves, at Bev's granddaughter already deep in a book from the shelf, as if she'd been given permission for something she'd been waiting for. But this is what she would have wanted. This exactly. Not a memorial. Something that works. That was what Paul had said. Ruth thought it was what Delia herself would have said, if anyone had thought to ask her. The first formal program session began at 10:30. Eleanor ran it, standing at the front of the room where Miss Carter had stood, introducing the reading program to 12 children ranging in age from 6 to 11 who sat in the old desks with the particular mix of wariness and curiosity that children bring to new places that might be good. Ruth stood at the back and watched. Eleanor asked the children what they liked to read. Several answered promptly. 2 said they didn't really like reading, which Eleanor received without judgment and with genuine interest, asking what they did like, what they were curious about, what they'd want to know more about if someone could tell them. By the end of those questions, she had her way in with each of them. Ruth thought about Miss Carter, 27 years in this room, doing this same work, starting each group of children from where they actually were, finding the way in. She thought, the room remembers this. Whatever rooms retain, this one has retained the shape of this kind of attention. Hank was in the corner with his original 6 students, working the program he'd been running for years, now with better light and shelves full of books and a table that wasn't folding. He caught Ruth's eye across the room and gave a small nod that said everything it needed to say. At noon, Ruth stepped outside for air. The September light was still extraordinary. The stone wall to the east held its violets, though they were nearly done for the season. The old bell in the tower sat silent, tarnished and patient. Carol came out behind her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "How do you feel?" Carol asked. Ruth took the coffee. She considered the question honestly. "Like something that was broken for a long time just became less broken," she said. "Not fixed. I don't think you fix something like this. But less broken." Carol nodded. "Dad would have been here all day. He would have found something to repair," Ruth said. "He always found something." "The something that actually needs repairing is 60 years of closed doors," Carol said. "And you're doing it." Ruth drank her coffee and looked at the building, at the light in the windows, at the shadow of movement inside. Children and adults moving through the room she'd found sealed and silent in February. She thought about a 9-year-old walking home down Bell Creek Road, not knowing the last day was the last day. She thought, she doesn't know yet what came after. But something came after. Something is here. In October, Ruth was appointed to the County Literacy Council. The vote was unanimous, which Philip Oakes told her was unusual. She drove to her first meeting in the county seat and sat at a table with 8 other people and listened for most of the meeting and spoke once, briefly, about what Whitmore was doing and what it was finding. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment, and then a woman named Sandra, who ran the county library system, said, "How do we get more of this?" Ruth had answers. Eleanor had helped her prepare them. She drove home from that meeting through the hardwood forest, which was deep in fall color now, the oaks gone gold and the maples red and the late afternoon light filtering through them the way it had on her first drive to Calder's mill in February, those long slanted bars through the bare trees. Only now the trees were not bare and the light was warmer, and she was not the same person who had made that first drive. She was not sure she could say precisely what she had become. Older, certainly. More tired in some ways, more awake in others. Still grieving Herbert in the way she would probably always grieve him. That steady ache that had become part of her weather. But moving. Purposeful in a way she hadn't been in a long time. Maybe in a way she had never been entirely before, because this was hers in a way that nothing in her adult life had been entirely hers. The house in Martinsville was quiet when she got home. She made tea and sat at Herbert's work table with her spiral notebook and wrote about the council meeting while it was fresh. She wrote about Sandra's question and her answer. She wrote about what she hoped for in the coming year. More children, more volunteers, a small grant she wanted to apply for to fund a summer reading program, a partnership with the county library that Sandra had tentatively offered. She wrote, Miriam, Aldridge left me a building. What she actually left me was a reason to keep going. I don't think she knew that's what I needed. I think she was thinking about Delia Harmon and about children in this county and about a promise that had been broken too long. But the building gave me somewhere to put my hands. And having somewhere to put your hands is most of what a person needs when they don't know what to do next. She sat back and read what she'd written. Then she added, Herbert would have understood that. He always understood that about work. That it isn't separate from living. That it is living. She closed the notebook and looked at the window where the basil was still growing, reaching toward the last of the October light. She thought about Delia's journal. The ocean she'd never seen but planned to. The interrupted plan. Ruth was 74 years old, and she had not seen everything she planned to see. But she was going somewhere. That was the thing. She was in motion in a direction that mattered, in a place where her motion was making something real, and the grief was still with her, but it was no longer all there was. On a Friday in November, the one-year anniversary of Herbert's death, Ruth drove to Calder's mill in the early morning before the center opened. She let herself in with the key on the cotton twine and stood in the room alone for a few minutes. The desks sat in their rows. The books filled their shelves. Delia's photograph watched from beside the door. The chalkboard held its two messages, 60 years apart. Ruth stood in the middle of the room and spoke quietly to the air, which she understood was not Herbert and not Delia and not Miriam, but was also somehow all of them, the accumulated presence of everyone who had cared about this room. I think we're doing it right, she said. Then she put on the lights and unlocked the front door and sat down at the teacher's desk to wait for the children. They came, as children do, in ones and twos at first, then in a small flood. Coats dropped on chair backs, books found on shelves, the particular noise of young minds arriving at a place where they are expected and welcomed. Destiny, the teenager who'd learned to hammer on the porch rebuild, came on Tuesday afternoons now as a junior volunteer. Bev's granddaughter had read 42 books since September and had a list of 42 more. The boy who didn't like reading in October had discovered, through Eleanor's careful questioning, that he liked ships, and there were 3 books about ships in the collection, and he had read all 3. Ruth watched it all from the teacher's desk, making notes, answering questions, doing the quiet work of keeping something functional that wants to live. Outside, down Bell Creek Road, the November trees had lost their leaves and the light came through them again in long slanted bars, and the stone wall held its shape against the cold, and the old bell in the tower sat silent, tarnished and patient, waiting for someone to ring it. Ruth made a note to herself. Find out how to restore the bell. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.